Okay. Very first thing we got to go through. Got to get through just a couple of definitions of some things that's here and what we have. Very first thing we're looking at is a periodic function, and that's a function that repeats y values. And remember, a function, what makes a function is that the x values don't repeat, that no matter what we do for one of these that we're going through. So periodic function is basically that no matter how many times we go around the unit circle and how much we change the degrees by, the x value by, whatever we're doing, that, it's always going to have the same y values as we go through this one. We can, there's only a certain set of numbers that we've got for this thing. That if we stretch it out, instead of on the unit circle, if we stretch that along like an XY axis, then we kind of see that. And then if we talk about a cycle, that's one complete pattern. Which is basically for us, that's one trip around the unit circle. Okay, so periodic function, it's a function that repeats y values. And a cycle for us is basically as you've gone through all the different values, basically in one pattern, and then you go around until you start getting repeat values. Once you start to get repeat values, then you know you're done with that one. Okay, for a period, basically that's the horizontal length. And the way we've got it set up being on the unit circle, that you've got to think about the period in this case is basically your circumference. All right, amplitude. The amplitude, that's your vertical length from zero. Okay, and then the last thing, which we don't talk about a whole lot, is the midline. And basically, that's a horizontal line that is halfway between your max and min values. Okay. So that's kind of the basics on everything before, because we're gonna work through and talk about a bunch of different things, and you got to at least have some idea what we're doing for these. So midline, it's what it sounds like. It's the middle line that's drawn between the top and the bottom of the graph. Amplitude is how far you move in one direction. So it's from zero. So basically, it's like half the height of the graph. If you think about it. Period is how long it is, and cycle is basically one trip around the circle. But again, we're going to stretch it out on a number line when we go through these. All right, so for the sine function, here's your basic setup for it. So it's y equals a times sine of b theta. And sometimes people get a little confused on that. So here's another way that you possibly could see it. A times the sine of bx. And that way, because some people get a little thrown off with theta. Theta in that case is just just another variable. So if you want to think about theta being like x, that those two things are kind of interchangeable for that part of it. And when you're doing sine, it's the sign of, it's almost like those two things are in parentheses. Okay. And your A and your B values are going to be just that. They're going to be some type of number, whether it's a fraction or a whole number or an integer or whatever it's going to be. But it's just, y is your variable. They use theta a lot, but again, think about theta basically is the same thing as x. It's just a variable that's there, and A and B will actually be some numbers that you've got in there. Okay, so when you think about the sine function, this is kind of the basics of where it goes back to. It's one of those two things that we're worrying about. Theta is, just think about that as being like x. It's just a different. I don't know why they use theta when they start talking about trig like this, but that's for some reason they do. They tend to go back and call that be theta. Okay, so here's where we get all the numbers from this thing. The absolute value of A is the amplitude. All right, your B value, that's the number of cycles, which doesn't really, you need that one, but it's more like the next thing that you need to kind of go with this one. And to get the period, which is one of the big things they're going to ask you to do in this case. The period is going to be 2 pi divided by B. So they're never going to ask you for the B value by itself. Now, they're going to ask you for the amplitude. So that part you're going to have. They're never going to ask you how many cycles they have, but you use the B value to help you figure out what the period is. So that's going to be the two big things they're going to ask you about in a lot of cases, the amplitude and what the period is going to be. All right, and here's what your basic graph looks like. Okay, and I think we looked at this a little bit the other day, how we took the unit circle, instead of it being in a circle, if we laid it out on a number line of how it would look. So basically, it's kind of set up like this. That the way you can kind of think about it is that each one of these things is like 90 degrees. So this would be 90 degrees. This would be 180. This would be 270, 360. This would be, if you think about it like in terms of radians, this is pi over 2. This would be pi, 3 pi over 2. The last one would then be 2 pi. All right, so your A value is going to be basically the top of the graph. Of course, negative A would then basically be the bottom of the graph. And it's going to look like your unit circle for this part of it, for the top half, because it basically, if you start at 0, you're going to go to the top, then you're back to the bottom, or back to the middle. And if you think about the unit circle, where it would normally kind of circle around this way, but we're going to stretch it out. So then you're going to go to the bottom and then back to the middle. So it's the unit circle, but it's just kind of, instead of looping around, we're going to stretch it out and kind of go from one thing to the other part of it. All right, so the period, whatever the 2 pi would be, that's going to be this last little mark that's right here. So that's where it's going to go, where you've run through all the cycles of the numbers, where you hit the top of everything on the top part of the graph, you run through everything on the bottom part of the graph. This last number that winds up back here, this is always going to be your period, which is 2 pi over B. All right, again, we started at 0. And we are going to have to find these numbers here, but I'm going to actually give you one where we actually have like specific values instead of just something in general, because if we don't do that one, it makes it a little bit tougher to kind of figure out exactly what's going on here. Okay, so again, A value is top, negative A is bottom. The B value, which is number of cycles, you use that to get the period, which tells you that after you do the full unit circle, you kind of go through that one. If you think about the sine graph, let me go back kind of to show you real quick. If we're doing sine, which is the second number, notice on the sine graph, we started at 0, then we went to 1/2, then you went to square root of 2 over 2, square root of 3 over 2, then you get to the top at 1, and then once you get to the top, then your y values then start to drop, right? You get back to 0, then you're back into the negatives, you get all the way down to -1, and then from there they start to go back up till eventually you get back to 0. And that's basically what we've done with this thing, is that we started with 0 for our sine value. We went up till we got to 1. We came back to 0. And then we started checking our negative values. It went negative, and then back around to there. Sorry, can you see that? All right, so let's go with y equals 4 times sine of x. All right, and again, very first thing you want to do is, there's your formula. So you got to use that formula to help you figure out what the a and b values are going to be. So from there, usually it's pretty easy to figure out. Your a value is 4, and your b value in this case is 1. All right, and again, for the amplitude, that's the absolute value of 4, which is just 4. And again, the b value is 1, and to get the period, that's 2 pi over b, which is 2 pi over 1, which is nicely enough just 2 pi. Okay, and again, for a lot of these, they're going to ask you, what's the amplitude, what's the period? That's going to be like an A, B question. Then they're going to have you pick out the graph and do some stuff with it. So when you graph this one, again, the basic graph of it hopefully should be pretty easy from here. Top of the graph, bottom of the graph is 4, negative 4, because that's just your amplitude going up and down. And again, 2 pi is that last number that's going to be here. And if you've got it cut into fourths like we've got it here, again, it's always going to have that same basic shape. You're going to go from the middle to the top, back to the middle, to the bottom, and then back to the middle. Okay, now, and the part we don't do, we're just basically going to stop at this one period over here, is that this thing, if you kept graphing it, it would just keep going and going and going, but we're not going to worry about that. We're basically just saying, all right, if we can get through one period, if we can get through one cycle of this thing, that's kind of the main thing we're going to do for this part of it. Okay, so here's where we have to kind of get part of this. The hard part on these is that you've got to get these 3 points. And to get these next 3 points to fill this thing back in, the first value is the key. Okay, and to get the first value, you just take the first, that period value, which in this case would be 2 pi, we've got here, divide it by 4. Because again, that's the period is how long the length is that we're looking for the horizontal length in this case. So we divide that by, because again, we got 4 different cuts to this thing. So we're going to divide it by 4 so we can figure out what each one of these would be. Now, the good thing is when we do this one, every single one of these, when we do this, the way it's going to work out, and it doesn't always work out this. When you get into pre-cal, start digging into these a little bit more, it may not always work out perfectly. But the way we've got these set up is that it should be the first one, like we take the part we've got here. So we take 2 pi and divide it by 4. If you simplify that, that's just 1 pi over 2, right? And the way this thing is going to work out when we go through these, and again, it won't always work out this way in pre-cal, is that if the first one is 1 pi over 2, the second one is going to be 2 pi over 2. The third one is going to be 3 pi over 2. So it should always be that it's going to go 1, 2, 3. And this technically would be the fourth one, which would then be 4 pi over 2, but it would simplify down to just 2 pi. So it should always work in that pattern. It's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just the numbers are going to have to simplify a little bit. So here's your first one. The second one is going to be 2 pi over 2. All we're going to do is just change that number. So where this was 1 pi over 2, the next one's going to be 2 pi over 2. But again, the 2's will cancel. That will just give us pi. The third one is going to be 3 pi over 2, which that doesn't simplify, so that's going to stay there. And again, technically, the fourth one would be 4 pi over 2, but that would simplify down to just 2 pi. So it's pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. Okay. And again, the numbers that we're going to pick, the way that I pick the numbers is it's always going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. But again, it's just that they're going to have something that's going to simplify along the way to kind of get you there. So it may be that the first number may be 1 pi over 6. The second number will be 2 pi over 6. The next number will be 3 pi over 6. But again, they're going to simplify along the way, but it still goes in that pattern of it's 1, 2, 3 as you kind of move through these. All right, let's do a couple more of these, make sure everybody's okay. All right, so let's do y equals sine of 4 theta. All right, if we do theta, it's basically, again, same theta or x is just interchangeable at this point. So if it's y equals sine of 4 theta, that's the same thing as y equals sine of b theta or x. So, and then this one, your a value is 1 and your b value is 4. So the absolute value of 1 is your amplitude. Well, that's just 1. Again, the b value is your number of cycles you've got, but again, we need that for the period. So that's 2 pi over 4. So A gives you the amplitude. To get the period, it's 2 pi over the b value. Again, if you simplify that down, that is just basically that is pi over 2. Okay, and anytime it's a sine graph, you know what the graph is going to look like because it's always going to have that same shape. You're going to have the top half of the graph, and then you've got the bottom half of the graph. Amplitude, that means we're going to go from 1 to -1. So they talked about the midline. The midline would be at 0 because it's halfway in between. And everything we're going to do, the midline is going to be at 0. Some of these that we work through, they may give you one and ask you to find it. That basically, to find the midline, you just figure out what's halfway between the two numbers. I mean, so, if it was between 4 and, if the max was 4 and the bottom was 2, your midline would be at 3 because it's halfway between 4 and 2 kind of thing. Last number here is pi over 2. And again, we've got to figure out what these three numbers are. We know it's going to be 1 pi over something. We've got to figure out what that something is. So to get our first number, it's pi over 2 divided by 4. All right, and the shortcut is if you take something that's a fraction, you divide it by a number, you basically just multiply these two things together. So it's going to be pi over 8 for your first number. Okay, so again, technically the first number is 1 pi over 8. Second number is going to be 2 pi over 8. And your third number is going to be 3 pi over 8. But if you've got 2 pi over 8, you can simplify and make that pi over 4. Third number is going to stay just like it is. It's going to stay 3 pi over 8. So that would be your 3 other numbers that you need to kind of get there. Yeah. Yep, there you go. Just add one numerator. Because again, the way we're setting this thing up is that once you've got the first number, you just double that to get to the second number. But if the first number is 1, you double that. Now it's going to be 2. The third one's 3 times as far, so it's 3. So it's always going to be 1, 2, 3. All right, but all right with that one? All right, let's get a couple more here. All right, so let's go with a half sine of 2 theta. Okay, so again, it's y equals a times sine of b theta. So we know what a is a half, and b is 2. Okay, amplitude's a half. Okay, and the period in this case works out kind of nice because it's 2 pi divided by the b value of 2, which is 2 pi over 2. The 2's cancel, so that means period's just plain old pi. All right, so there's your basic graph again. And for this one, your first number should actually be pretty easy because if you take your period, and divide it by 4, well, that's just pi over 4. So pi over 4. And again, technically, it's 1 pi over 4. So your second number would be 2 pi over 4. But you can take 2 pi over 4 and make that 1/2, so that's really pi over 2. Your third number is going to be 3 pi over 4. So it would put us there. Okay, so if you can break it down so that it's 1 pi over something for your period when you go to that point value, again, it's always going to be 1, 2, 3. Again, the fourth one should be 4 because that's you're cutting it into fours. So it should always follow that pattern, but it's 1, 2, 3, 4. But again, you got to simplify some of the numbers sometime as you're working through this thing. Okay, now one thing we haven't done yet. Didn't do any negatives yet. So I'll show you what a negative looks like. So let's go -3 times the sine of 8 theta. All right, A value is -3, B value is 8, so no big deal there for those. Again, for amplitude, this is one time where the amplitude is a little different than your A value. If you take the absolute value of -3, your amplitude is just 3. And for your B value, that is for the period, that's 2 pi divided by B. So 2 pi divided by 8, which is pi over 4. Okay, so we got 3, -3, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Now, here's the big difference on this one. If the number is negative, you've got to, with the A value being negative, if it was just 3 sine theta, we know we would go up. If it's -3, which way do we need to go to get to the negatives first? Got to go down, right? So if it's negative, you're going to go to the bottom half of it first, and then you'll come back to the top half of it later. So if your A value is negative, that means you got to graph the bottom half first. So anytime your A value is negative, that basically tells you which part you've got to graph first on this thing. Okay, so now we got to get the other numbers. So that's the one thing that's different. If you've got a negative A value, you got to go down instead of going up first. Okay, and to get the first number, it's pi over 4 over 4. And again, the shortcut is if you do that, you just multiply these two numbers together. There you go. So that's pi over 16. Again, technically that's 1 pi over 16. Second number is 2 pi over 16. And then your third number would be 3 pi over 16. But if you got 2 pi over 16, you can make that pi over 8. So 1 pi over 16, 2 pi over 16, third number would be 3 pi over 16. And then finally, your last number would be the pi over 4 you had there. Okay, but again, it should always pretty much go that it's going to go 1, 2, 3. It's just a matter of how you simplify the numbers on those. Question. I'm going to show you some cosine graphs. Okay, for cosine, we're going to switch from sine to cosine. The only difference is we're using sine instead of cosine. The A value is still.
Is this the same set of numbers?
Yeah. With the A value, the absolute value of the A value is still your amplitude. And the B value is still your number of cycles. And again, the period is still 2 pi over B. So the setup for sine and cosine is exactly the exact same thing. The only thing that's different is the graph. Because last time we were doing sine, and if we started with sine, bless you, if we started with sine over here, The sine value was 0. Then we went to 1/2. We went to square root of 2, square root of 3 of 2. We eventually worked up to 1, and we went back down. If we start at 0, what's your cosine value here? It's at 1. So for this one, we're going to start with this graph, not in the middle, but we're going to start with it at the top here. And then if you work through your cosine values, they get smaller. That the very first thing they're going to do is they're going to go to 0. And then after we get to 0, then the actual numbers go to negatives. So we go up to -1. So we started at 0, and then they get smaller till we get to 0. And then they keep on going till we get down to -1. And then once they get to -1, then they start to come back up. And then eventually they will get back till they get back to +1. Oh, sorry, you can't see that. My bad. So that's going to be your graph there. So your graph for cosine is going to look more like a bell or a bowl. Now, again, technically it keeps going on forever and ever. So if we laid the two graphs on top of each other, they'd look almost the same. But we're just looking at one little snippet of the graph, and this is kind of the snippet we're looking at. So a value is still here, negative a value is still here. Your period is still 2 pi over b when you end up here. The only difference is your graph is going to look kind of like a bowl for this part. If it winds up being negative, then it looks like a upside down bowl or mountain. So, all right, here we go. We'll do a couple examples to make sure we're good. Hopefully this doesn't freak anybody out too much. So for example 1, we're going to do 4 times the cosine of 1/2 x. All right, so a value is 4, b value is 1/2. Again, amplitude's pretty easy. If you take the absolute value of 4, it's still just 4. And to get the period, that is 2 pi over 1/2. All right, but what if we do 2 pi over 1/2? So we go, So let's do like we did back in 6th grade math. We're going to keep it. Because it's really, if you think about it, this is really 2 pi divided by 1/2, right? So we can keep it, we can change it, and we can flip it. And we could have really done that back here with this fraction. We could have gone keep, change, flip here. But if we do that, that winds up being 2 pi times 2 over 1, which just means it's just 2 pi times 2. So that is 4 pi. Okay, so our amplitude is 4. In this case, our period winds up being 4 pi. All right, still going from 4 to -4. But again, if we're doing cosine, instead of being top half, bottom half, this one's going to be the bell-shaped curve. So wherever this value is that's here, you start there. So we start at 4. And then if you're at the top, there's only one way to go. You got to go down. Before you get to the bottom, you got to go through the middle. Then you get to the bottom, back to the middle, and then back to the top. Kind of like absolute value. So it does kind of look like absolute value, but instead of being like a V shape, you got to make it kind of flowy, kind of curvy because it's U shape. All right, and for your first number, this one should be really easy because we're going to take 4 pi, we're going to take our period and divide it by 4. Well, that cancels out, so that means this is just 1 pi or just pi. This is 1 pi, the next one is 2 pi, the third one is 3 pi. There you go. All right, so everybody all right with that? So again, the only difference is where they start. Sine starts at 0. Cosine value is going to start at whatever this value is. It's here, and it gives you kind of a bowl shape, or it's either a hill or a valley. Basically, what it is. It's an upside down U shape, or it's a right side up U shape. All right, so let's throw another one at you here. Let's go with y equals negative 8 cosine of 2 pi theta. Let's get funky with it a little bit. Okay, so the a value is negative 8. The b value this time is not just 2, it's 2 pi. All right. So for the amplitude, it's the absolute value of negative 8, which is just 8. And again, the period is 2 pi divided by the b value. So it's 2 pi divided by 2 pi, which is just 1, because everything cancels. And if you're thinking, well, how are we going to show that on the number line? Well, it's going to be easier than what you think it is. Don't overthink it in this case. All right, so this thing ends at 1. What's 1 divided by 4? It's 1 over 4. There you go. If that's 1 over 4, the next one is 2 over 4, but we can simplify 2 over 4 down to half. The next one's 3 over 4. Again, technically this would be 4 over 4, but we know that's just going to simplify down to 1. All right, we're going from 8 to negative 8. And again, the only difference is with cosine is that because it starts at negative 8, this one you're going to start at the bottom. You're going to start at that number. Then you're going to go to the middle. Then you're to the top, back to the middle, and then back to the bottom. Again, just got to make it a nice kind of curvy, flowy shape as you go through that. Okay, so sine value always starts at 0. The cosine value always starts at your a value. So if you have to back here, cosine graphs, you basically want to do this one. You can say cosine graphs start at the a value. So whenever you're doing the sine graphs start at 0. Cosine graphs are going to start at your a value. And that's really the one thing you've got to kind of memorize as you go through those. And again, the easy thing is that wherever you start, wherever you are, you always, before you can go from top to bottom, you've always got to go through the middle. So the middle is going to be every other point when you go through this one. So like this one, we started at the bottom, we went to the middle, got to the top, back to the middle, then to the bottom. If we kept going, it would have been to the middle, top, middle, bottom, middle, top, middle, bottom. The middle is always going to be in the middle because it's always going to be in between the next couple pieces there. All right, need another one? Or you think we're good? Then we're good? One more? All right, one more. Won't take long. All right, one more. Uno más. Let's see. Let's go with 3 cosine 4 theta. A value is 3. B value is 4. So amplitude, again, doesn't really do anything in that case. Absolute value of 3 is just 3. And for the period, that is 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Okay. And again, if here's the thing, if you know that cosine, if you can lock this in your memory, that cosine starts at the a value. If you're at the top, the only way to go from the top is to the bottom. But before you can get to the bottom, you got to go through the middle, and then you can get to the bottom. And then once you're at the bottom, there's only one way to go. That's up. Before you get to the top, you got to go back to the middle, and then you're back to the top. All right, this thing ends at pi over 2. And again, to get the first number, it's pi over 2 divided by 4. So we'll multiply those two things together. So that's pi over 8. Again, technically that's 1 pi over 8 because it's first number. Second number is 2 pi over 8. But we can simplify that down and make that, what, pi over 4? Third number would be 3 pi over 8. So we put us there. So again, it should always go 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's just a matter of simplifying these numbers because you're going to have some that's going to simplify just a little bit.